Okay, now let's start for real. So this is session 4 of StackSchool. We're covering backend integration today. So I'm Anar, that's Andy. We're going to be presenting. So hope you are excited. Here's what we're going to be covering. You can read that if you want. And also you can scan this QR code. It'll take you to a GitHub repo where we have a write-up of stuff. If you want to check that out. I'll be honest though, I think this QR code is the wrong QR code. It's actually last workshop's QR code. But if you navigate throughout the GitHub repo, it'll take you to the right one. So yeah, there you go. Yeah, let's leave that up for a second. Okay, and just a reminder, since it's been, like 2 weeks, we have tokens. They look like this. And we're going to pass them out if you ask questions or if you answer questions. And if you get the most tokens in a workshop, you get a prize. So that's very fun, very cool. We're kind of running low. Unfortunately, we only have 4 left. But we're going to replenish them, I think, next week. So yeah. And we're also going to have a grand prize for the top 3 most tokens earned in the quarter. I think they're going to be different from these, unfortunately. But yeah, we're going to have a grand prize. So keep an eye out for that. And just to refresh your memory, last time we talked about servers and APIs. And in our demo, we added a bunch of post-related endpoints to our server. So that's stuff like get feed and like, liking a post, stuff like that. And also on the, we didn't get to this physically, like at the actual workshop because we had some technical issues with our laptop dying. But after the fact, we added a user data model, which is like a schema for users. And we also added some user-related endpoints. So that's stuff like, login and like creating a new user, stuff like that. Yeah, so check out the write-up if you want to refresh your memory even further in more detail. And I do want to say there's one little patch that we have to add to the demo, and that is cores. So make sure that you add this stuff, or that you do this. Oops. Otherwise, the stuff that you do today is not going to work. So I'm just going to show you where you need to do it. So we have this line 3. Well, first you have to yarn add cores. Make sure you do that. And also this line, add it, and this line. I'm just kind of gloss over what it does because it's not that important. And also I don't really know. I'll be real with you. But it does change the fact that it's the difference between your stuff working and not working. So add it. Yeah. Okay. And just to ensure that we remember everything from last time, I'm going to ask a couple questions. So first off, does anyone want to answer what makes a computer a server, right? Like what did we talk about last time? The one distinguishing characteristic. Anybody?
I'll take a shot.
Okay.
The server essentially is what's going to be receiving requests and returning data.
Right, yeah, exactly. That is what we have up here. So you can see that the client computer up here is going to send requests to the server. Server is going to fulfill them, and then it's going to send a response back with some information about what happened. Right, so very good. Another question. What is an HTTP request method? And as a hint, an example of one is on the slide. So yeah, anyone want to take a shot at that? Might be helpful to look at last week's slides if you don't remember, or anyone else have like an inkling, like some idea? First of all, here's a better question. Let me start with this. What is the request method in this HTTP request? What does get do?
Basically, retrieves data from the server database, display back to the user.
Right, yeah, so you're just getting data from the server. So if we zoom out from that, get is an example of a specific instance. What does the get, or what does the request method tell the server?
Basically tells how you're going to interact with the data.
Exactly, yeah. So there you go. We have this get request here. That's an example of a request method. And a method is going to tell your server what you want it to do, right? So some examples are get, post, put, delete up here. And I recommend refreshing your memory on what those do because they're going to be important today. And one final question, sorry if I'm asking a lot of questions, but I really want to make sure that you remember what we talked about. How does the client know what the server can do? Like, in other words, like, how does it know what it can ask for from the server? And as a hint, we have this menu up here that we talked about last time. This one might be, yeah?
Yeah. Client knows because we have an API, which is programming interface, which tells the programmer and inherently the client what server, what data the server has.
Right, yeah. So the server has an API, which is a collection of endpoints, like you said, and each endpoint is something that the server can do for the client, right? Cool. So now that we have that out of the way, it is time for front end. I don't know, some of you might be like happy about that, some of you might be sad, depending on your perspective. But unfortunately, we are full stack developers here, so we have to care about both. And even though we're doing mostly front end today, it's like we're working on the front end. We still have to worry about back end stuff, so that's why I wanted to do the refresher before. Yeah, so we're going to be doing our front end in React. It's going to be helpful, I will say, to have some experience with basic web development stuff like HTML, CSS, and some React basics. We don't expect you to know everything, but we're going to be zooming through it kind of fast if you aren't familiar. So yeah, just a heads up there. Okay. Oh, thank you. Wait, oh, okay. Cool. So we're making our Twitter clone, right? That's the app that we're developing as a demo. And just looking at this Twitter clone app screenshot up here, what like pops out at you the most? Like, to me, in my eyes, like the feed is like the first thing I notice, right? And the feed is just a list of posts, right? So I think it makes sense to start there with our front end. I think that's a good place to start. And luckily for us, we have a list of posts stored in our database. So let me just pull that up real quick. Oh, you can see me messing with the network access stuff because we've been having a lot of issues with that lately. Yeah, so here you go. This is our list of posts. We only have a couple of them right now, just 5, but that's good enough. So yeah, we have that in our database, right? But how are we going to access them in our front end, right? So we know from previous workshops, previous weeks, we used a library called Mongoose to access data from our database and pull it into our backend, right? But what are we going to use for backend to front end? Is there like a library similar to Mongoose but more general? And the answer is yes. It's called Axios. And Axios is just another JavaScript library. It is going to give you a convenient way to interact with your backend, right? So just allows you to make HTTP requests programmatically. Okay, and thankfully we don't have to write them manually anymore as we were doing last time. I know it's kind of a hassle to do it, but Axios is going to abstract away all of that for us, which is really nice. Thank God. Let's just do it. Like, I'm not going to sit here and like throw a bunch of like functions at you. I'm just going to show you how to use it with an example. So I'm going to pull up VS Code here, and yeah, I'm going to go into my app.js on my front end. And I'm going to make sure that Axios is imported because otherwise it will not work. Also, make sure that you yarn add Axios if you haven't already. That's going to be an important step. Otherwise, it won't work. Right? So going up here, I want to make a function. I'm going to call it getFeed. And as the name suggests, it's just going to get the feed. So I'm going to make an error function here. Get feed. Oops. There we go. And get feed is going to make an Axios call. So this is the way you do it. It's going to make a GET request. So the way to make a GET request is just use the GET function, right? And within this GET function, I'm going to pass in some URL that represents the endpoint that we want to retrieve. So I'm just going to make a new variable here that has the URL, just so we don't have to like keep typing it again and again every time. In our case, it's going to be localhost 8080 because we are developing on our local server, right? So http://localhost, 8080, not 70, 80. Yeah, so in here, I'm going to pass that URL and /feed. So basically what's happening here, oh, and as a reminder, we have this /feed endpoint in our server. All it does is it goes to the MongoDB database and it retrieves all the posts and it returns them in a response object, right? So the way to access this is going to return a promise, right? So if you remember from our databases and asynchronous programming workshop, we talked about promises. It's just like a little container for some object that you don't know what the value of it is yet. To resolve it, we can use either .then or async await. So I'm just going to go with .then in this case. And then we pass in a function that tells you what to do with the value, right? So in this case, I just want to make sure that everything works as expected. So I'm just going to log it in the console right here. And we want to access the data in the response. So that's why I'm adding the data field there. And I'm also going to make sure that if there are any errors that we know about them. So I'm going to log any errors to the console. Okay. And just for now that I have this function, you should never do this, but just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to put this, I'm going to call this function here. Don't do this, but yeah, I'm just going to do it for now. Now I'm going to start up my backend. So here I am in I've made two terminals just for convenience. This is in my backend folder. This one is in my front end folder. I'm going to call yarn start on my backend to start my server. And I'm going to call yarn start on my front end to start my React app. Okay, so just give that a second. I'm just going to pull this up. Oh, and I do want to get rid of all this boilerplate too. I forgot about that. We want a clean new app. Okay, cool. There we go. I want to pull up the console. And you can see we have array 5 logged like a couple times. And you can see that it does have the content from our database. So that's perfect. That is what we want. Just going to close that. So basically all that happened was I used Axios to make a GET request to my backend. And then I just logged the console I logged the data that it received from the backend. So let me go back to the slides here. All right. So as a recap, make sure you add Axios to your project. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And make sure you import Axios as well. And then to make a GET request in particular, you're going to do axios.get and then some URL. In our case, it was localhost 8080, right? /feed. And it's going to return a promise. What's up? So Fetch is great, but it's kind of limited in that we can't put stuff in our, it's more difficult to put stuff in your request body, right? Axios makes it very easy to make put and post requests and stuff like that, and put stuff in the body and like upload stuff to the server, right? And you'll see an example of that later on when we make post requests. So yeah. Cool. So any questions, any more questions on Axios? I know it's kind of like I just showed you an example, but it's really not that tough. I think like it's pretty intuitive. You just make, to make like a post request, you would just do axios.post. To make a put request, you do axios.put, etc. There you go. And yeah, we're gonna want to handle the return value with .then or async await, since it is a promise. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have our posts. We want to display them as our feed, right? But how would we do that, right? Like your first thought might be something like a for loop. Like potentially we could iterate through our post array one at a time and do something. I don't know what we would do, but we would do something to display each one, right? Unfortunately, that is not going to work. We can't do that in React because recall that the place that we put our like stuff that we're putting on the display is in our return statement, right? And you can't put a for loop in a return statement because it expects a value, right? Or a for loop is not a value. So you can't do that. So what should we do instead? Well, we do something called mapping, right? And that guy knew. That guy's happy that he knew. Yeah, so just to talk about that a little bit, mapping is basically accomplishes the same thing as a for loop, right? But it does it in a different way that makes it so that you can put it in that return statement here, right? So let's say, just to illustrate this, I have an array of cartoon characters, right? And we want to get the live action version of each of them for some reason. And we have this function, get live action, and it takes as input some cartoon, so one of these, and it outputs the live action version of that cartoon, right? So if we were to map over this array, first what would happen is it would create a copy of it, and that's very important to note, creates a copy. It doesn't operate on the original array. And then what it's going to do, it's going to iterate through the array and apply this get live action function to each item in it. So just for demonstration, we have get live action applied to Manny from Diary Kid, we get this guy. To Garfield, we get Garfield. To the Aladdin from Genie, we get Will Smith. To Aang from Avatar, we get this guy. And SpongeBob, we get SpongeBob, right? So in JavaScript, does that make sense, by the way? Is that clear? Just because I know it might be kind of confusing a little bit. What's up? Not quite. So what it does, it's basically the same as if we were to use a for loop, right? And call that function, the get live action function, on each element, and then create a new array from that, right? So the get live action function, all it does, like, as you can see here, it just takes some cartoon character and then it converts them to the live action version, right? Is that clear? Well, it's not, it's just for demonstration. It's not, we don't have it in our actual thing. Yeah. I mean, you could do it, but like, we're not going to. It's not, yeah. It's just like, you know, some arbitrary thing. So the way we do it in JavaScript, in the context of JavaScript, is we call the we call the map function on some array. So that array could be like our cartoon characters array. And then we pass in the function that we want to apply to the elements of the array. So in English, what this is saying is we want to apply function to elements of array and get a copy of array with that function being applied. All right. And for React, this function is going to return some JSX. JSX, if you don't remember, is like our HTML-like stuff. So hopefully you're all familiar with that. And let's do it, right? let's do it. First of all, what I want to do is make a new variable. I'm just going to call it posts, and it's going to represent our posts. And I'm just going to leave a little comment here. This is problematic, and you'll see why very soon. What's up? Oh, so let and const are two keywords in JavaScript, right? Let is a way to designate a variable that you can change, right? Const means that you can't change it. So it's a constant, right? Yeah, so we are letting post equal the empty array. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in here, instead of console.logging my post array, I'm going to just set posts to response.data. Okay. And then down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call map, right? So I'm going to call, this is my array. I'm going to call map on that array. And what I want to do is I want to pass in a function, and what it's going to do is going to return some JSX, right? And in this case, I want, sorry, was there a question back there? Or okay, cool. So what I want this function to do that I pass into posts is it's going to return some JSX. That JSX is going to represent a post, right? So basically what's happening is I'm converting every element in posts to a real post that we have on our screen, right? So, oops, I want this to be here. So this variable here, this argument actually, is going to represent an item in our map function, right? So we have a post in our post array, which is an element of posts. And then we just give that a name so that we can access it down here. Oh, Discord notification. And then what I want to do, oh, I don't need these brackets. Sorry. 1 second. Okay. /div. So I'm just going to make a div here. And then just to refresh your memory on what the post schema looks like, each post has some content, right? It has a user, the number of likes, and the timestamp. So I'm going to just display that all down here. So I'm going to make an h3 tag, and that h3 tag is going to have our post.user. And just remember that in React, whenever we have JavaScript within some JSX, we need to wrap it in brackets. So that's why I'm doing that. And I'm also going to make a p tag that's going to have our post.content. And I'm also going to just make another p tag that has the number of likes. And oops. And also the what was it, timestamp, right? Timestamp. Okay. And yeah, so here we have successfully mapped our post array to some JSX elements. And hopefully what we see when we start our React app is that we have all our posts from our database displayed on our on the app, right? So let's try that. What's up? Oh, so this is a HTML tag, right? So H3 stands for header 3. A header is like, it's like some big text, right? And 3 means it is the third largest. So we have H1, that's the biggest, H2, next biggest, H3 is the next biggest. And P stands for paragraph, so that means that we have paragraph. So it's just like some smaller text, some body text, right? That makes sense? Oh, just, it's like an arbitrary thing. It's like a visual. Yeah, I could put H2 there. I could put H4, whatever. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to start my React app. And we see that nothing happened. Uh-oh, nothing happened. So let me go back to my slides here. Why isn't it working? What's going on? And basically the answer is React is lazy, right? React doesn't want to do more work than it needs to. It doesn't want to refresh more often than it has to. So to address this, let's talk about hooks very briefly. So we have one hook, and a hook, just to give like a quick definition, is any function that has use in the name and also like it deals with some functional logic, some component logic in React. So useState, it's going to address the laziness thing. Like, how do we know when we want to refresh the app, right? basically we just tell React, hey, watch this variable. If it changes, refresh the app, right? And these variables are going to be part of something called the state of the application, right? And here's an example of the syntax just to show it real quick. So we have this array destructuring here going on. So useState is going to return an array of 2 items. One of those items is going to be the variable that you want to watch. And one of those items is going to be a function that sets that variable, right? And into useState, we pass a default value, right? So this default value is what this variable, this watched variable, is going to be initially set to, right? But we also have another issue. Remember back when I first showed the get feed, or like when I was printing the stuff to the console, like with all the posts, you saw it did it like 10 times or something. We don't want that, right? We only want it to print to the console, or we only want it to get the post once when it initially loads the app, right? So we use useEffect to do that. And again, React is lazy. We only want our API calls to occur at a certain time, and that's when the app loads, right? So to do this, we just use useEffect, and we pass in some function here. It's going to perform some task, and then we also give it some dependency array, right? So this dependency array, it's the stuff that you want to watch. If it changes, then it's going to update, or sorry, it's going to call this function here. And I know this is like very, like a lot. So if you haven't seen this before, I'm sorry. But like, I definitely recommend digging into it in depth. It's pretty important in the context of React. I recommend checking out StackSchool in previous iterations if you want to dig deeper on this. But for now, I'm just going to use it. So first of all, I'm going to import useState and useEffect from React, because otherwise it would not work. And then down here, instead of just having this this like assignment here, I'm going to useState and pass in the default value of empty array, right? And then I'm going to destructure my posts, and I'm going to give the function a name, set posts. So set posts is just going to be our function that we use to set posts, right? And then down here, when we get our feed, I'm going to set posts. So this is going to set the post variable equal to whatever we get from our backend, right? Yeah, and down here, I'm going to wrap this function call in a useEffect. So here we go. So I pass in a function, and then I also pass in a dependency array. We're going to leave it empty because we only want it to happen once when it initially loads. And then right here. So now, basically what we've done is we've made it so that React knows to refresh when post is updated with this useState thing here. And we also are only going to call our API once when our app initially loads, right? So let's see this in action. Hopefully it works. So yeah, there we go. So what's happened is we've taken our post array, we've mapped the content to these posts, right? So we have Nate and some content, which is very cool. So yeah, I'm going to pass it off to Andy now, and he's going to talk about making posts. Oh, what's up?
I have a quick question regarding the use of useEffect.
Okay.
If we don't wrap get feed in a useEffect, what's the difference between having it in useEffect versus not having it in useEffect?
Right. So remember when I didn't have it in the useEffect, we saw it logged like 10 times in the console, right? So it called get feed like a ton of times, and we don't want that. So we use useEffect to tell React when we want it to call that function. And in this case, since we have an empty dependency array, it's only when it initially loads. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for asking that. That was a good question. So let's go.
Okay, cool. So now that we've made our feed, we actually want to make the posts that are in our feed. The posts that we had up there in the demo were posts that we've added before. We haven't actually, made a way for people to, users to, type a message and post it. So like in this small Twitter example, right, you type your tweet and you hit tweet, and there's your post. So usually whenever you want to create a React component or just a part of a website, in this case, we're going to create, similar to this Twitter thing, a place for a user to type their message or their tweet and then post it. We're going to make an input box as well as a post button. So this sounds very simple right now, but going into larger projects and doing things with bigger components or bigger interfaces on the website, it's good to have a straightforward plan. So, right, we want a message box where a user can write their message and a post button where they can create a post with the user's message. And ours will look like this, very not beautiful. We don't have any CSS, so this is what it will look like. In addition to our plan, let's get a little bit more deep into it. So what do we want our message box to be? Well, there's this cool built-in HTML tag called input, and we can use this along with a React state in order to update our post with some message contents. And this is what our input box will look like, as well as a post button. Again, I know this is super simple. There's a built-in HTML tag called button, just a button, and we can use this button when we click it to call our API and add a post to our database. And we've already made the sort of feed part of the API and interface, so that's already there. So now I'll be demoing. I have slides with like short descriptions of what we're doing further on. Please feel free to follow along with them. I'll also reference them, but for now, we're going to get into it. So first off, we need a new state. Just like when we were making the feed and we need to update our posts, and just having a normal JavaScript variable isn't enough. We need a new state for the actual message contents, because the user is going to be typing in something, and we need to save that something so we can later send it to our database. So again, this will contain the contents, user messages, and it will allow us to send these contents to our API endpoint. And this is what our use state will look like. We have this state will be an empty string at first, and the use state really is just a function. It returns an array of 2 elements. The first in our covered, it's just our state, and then a setter for our state. And again, this is what one of our posts looks like, and this is what we want our state to cover, is this message. So when writing these Axios requests, it's very important to reference your schema and API, because what Axios is really doing is just calling your API endpoint, and that's something we already wrote. And the syntax for this is very similar to our API, as you saw before with Einar's feed request. So as we can see here, this is our API sort of function, and we want to create a new post in this case. This is our API. We're going to be writing an Axios request similar to what Einar wrote, but it's very good to reference this because it's similar. We can see that our endpoint is /feed/new, and we'll also want to reference our schema. And here we can see that our schema requires us, if we want to make a request, it requires some sort of content, so a user message and a user. And this is important because it's basically the building blocks for writing our Axios request. So now time to actually get into the code and write our Axios request. So as we saw here, just going back in our API, we're using app.post, so we're making a post request. All a post request is just creating something in our database. So here for our add post Axios request, and I'm using a different syntax for function, a function, and I used a arrow function. It really doesn't matter, at least in this case. So we make our add post function, Axios.post. We're making a post request, and we're going to type the endpoint to our API. So that is just our URL. We made that variable before, plus /feed/new. And just going into the code, after the get feed function that Anar made, just as a different way of showing it, I will use this post syntax. We're going to make our function, right? Oh, and before that, we need to make our state. And generally, when you're making states, usually it's const. Let and const are both ways of making a variable in JavaScript. But for our state here, we want message contents. I believe it's something different in the slides. It really doesn't matter what you put here, so long as you know what you're using. And just good syntax is to use for the function that's return second is, it's a setter, so just put set in front of it, right? We have our message, and we're going to set our message. And then we want to make this a state, and it will initialize with an empty string. And now back to our add post function, right? We're going to be using our Axios request, so axios.post. And then the first thing that this takes is the endpoint, which I believe is the URL and /feed/new. And then the second thing that a post request can take with Axios is, what do we want to actually post to our database? So in this case, going back to the slides, we want to add the contents and the user. This is already required by our API, so we have to send these with our post request. And here you can see it's just basically an object. So we have our content, our state, and a user, which we don't have users implemented right now. So you can just send it a string for a username. It can be whatever you want. Here it's test user. So let's add that in right now. And your state, and also a user. And for this, we'll just put test user like in the slides. And after this, Axios, this function, the axios.post function will return a promise. Just reiterating what Axios is, it's an HTTP client, and it basically allows you to use your API endpoints to make asynchronous requests. So that's why we're using Axios. We basically just want the asynchronous capability. And it also makes it very easy to access our API endpoints and interact with like the user interface, right? We can just click a button and we'll call this Axios request. So, right, we want to log the response and catch any errors. This isn't entirely necessary, but then Axios will return a promise anyways. So it'll be good to log it. And I believe, I guess, so when I put .catch console.error, there's several ways of like logging an error. Console.error, if you know what file descriptors are, it will return to like a standard error instead of just like going to standard out. If you know what that is, it doesn't matter too much. You can also type console.log and put error in the middle. It really doesn't matter. But we'll take our response and it'll be an error function. I'm just going to do this all in one line. We'll log our response. And then we'll catch any errors. And that should be good. So, right, very simple. It's very similar to our API that we wrote, right? Instead of saying app.post, we're saying axios.post. And there's some more semantic differences. But this is pretty much it. So going back, we also want to check for empty content. So if the user just hits post and there's no actual message there, we want to check for that. And this is pretty simple. It's just a straightforward conditional statement, just an if. We want to check if our state, so our message is an empty string. If it's an empty string, we can either log it to the console. You can also use alert. It'll put a pop-up on your screen, and that's more informative to the user than a console log. So wow, this is super quick. So if the message, our state, is an empty string, then we want to console log. Oh, and just to show you the syntax for this, an alert, which makes literally a pop-up box, is just this, and you can put whatever you want into it. So I'll use alert for now. And also, in order to not actually make our request, we're going to return early, because we don't want to make a request and we don't want to like post an actual message if it's an empty message. And back to the slides, switching a lot. We also want to remember to reset our post content state or our message state, right? After a user posts a message, we don't want it to then like append to the end of the message and just make this giant message. We want to reset what the message is. So we'll use our setter, so set message to an empty string. And right now, this should all work. It shouldn't show anything on your actual React app, like in localhost on your browser, because we haven't actually implemented the JSX or the actual user interface. So now we'll make our input message box. This is pretty much the code. It's good practice whenever you're making like a React component. Usually you'll make it in a different file, but it's good practice to wrap it with some sort of wrapper. In this case, I just used a div. And then basically we're going to use that input box that we covered earlier. Input literally lets you type in a message. And input has several properties, such as type, well, it's text, but it also has an event handler, which is called onChange. And using this event, whenever you type something into our input box, onChange will basically make that event, and we'll use it with our state and set what the message is actually going to be. And this will update in real time. So if you type a letter, it will update our state. And that's what the onChange event is. The placeholder is just a property. It's before you type something in an input box. It'll just have some text there. And our value, this is also important, because we're referencing this with our event, so the e.target.value, we want to reference our state, because, well, the value is our message. So going on to the demo, we'll go in here, and because our input box and our post button aren't going to be like a post, we don't want to put it in our map, so we'll put it above, right? And then we're going to use an input box. So generally when you use input, it's going to be just one tag. The syntax for this is just a slash and a ending caret. So we'll use input, and just to make it easier on our eyes, we will do that. We will like separate the properties. You can do this all on one line if you want, but yeah. So our type is text, our value is the state, and we do need to wrap it around with our escape to JavaScript curly brackets so that we can actually access our state. And then we want our event handler, and this will, again, it's an arrow function, because we don't want to just call set post contents just on start. It's something called mounting, if you want to look into that. So for onChange, we will again escape and use our arrow function, which takes in one argument, and we'll use our setter and basically set it to this target value, which is our property really. So also add some placeholder text just to make it pretty. And right now, if it compiled successfully, oops, oh no. Chrome. I just want to access the web. Oh, escape? Oh, I have to go. Okay, my bad. So now on our little website here, you should see a little input box at the top. I'll zoom in. Yeah, right there. Message here. So that's our placeholder when we type stuff in. This will be our user's message. And yeah, so now we want to make our post button. And now, so here's our post button. It's going to be that button tag that we talked about before, and it will use an on-click event handler. It's when you click the button, it will call this. The reason we're passing it with an anonymous arrow function is that if you just have the add post function in the on-click, it will call it when the function, when basically this JSX is mounted, or this sort of item is mounted. All that means is that basically it's going to call it infinitely, and we really don't want that to happen. So here we're going to pass it with as a reference to an anonymous arrow function, and basically all this does is just stop add post from getting called infinitely many times. This can cause a lot of like undefined behavior. It can cause infinite rendering and cause React to crash. So we don't want that. So we'll add our button in to our sort of component right next to the input box. It'll go in that div wrapper that we made before. And yeah. So we'll add a button, and then it will take properties, and we're going to want not on change, but on click. And in on click, we'll have an anonymous arrow function with no arguments, and it will basically just, again, call our add post Axios request, which is very cool. And that should be good. Now with the button tag, you will need to, because we want to put text inside of it. So we'll just have post. So basically it's just like the event, or you can think of it as like, we're taking this input box that we have, and now we want some property of our, it's basically representing the input box, but we use it to get some sort of property of our input box. In this case, we're trying to get the value property, which is our state, and this basically just sets it. E is just like, it's just common syntax to use E for this. And now after we add our button, we can go back to our React app, and now you should see a post button and our message box. So now if we want to type some message, hello world, and we hit post, it should post all the way down here, and it's not posting. How do I pull up DevTools on your computer?
Command.
Oh no, we can do it that way too. Let's just go. We can just pull up console. Yeah, cool. Oh, okay. So we're having a little bit of trouble. So one thing with the map function is map actually, when you're using it, has two values. It'll have like your post or something in the array or some sort of list that you're trying to access, and it will also give you an index. So right here, we'll just add a new variable I for your index. And if you want to, because this is an arrow function, just wrap it with parentheses, because these are the arguments for your arrow function. And then basically when you're iterating over some sort of item that you're making. In this case, it's our div. You just want to add a key, and we'll escape to JavaScript and add our index. And right now, this is important later on, especially when you're making components. But right now, it's just to get React to stop yelling at us. This is one of the warnings it was throwing in our console log. And the other is, what is it doing? Post? Oh, did I write post? Oh, it's posts. Wait, what? Oh, post? Oh, wait, what? Did I get that endpoint wrong? Right now I'm just gonna, it's doing some funky error message, so I'm gonna look back at the API just to make sure if our input's right. And it is /feed/new. Any ideas?
Refresh.
This is not refined, yeah. Oh, it works. Okay, it was just the key warning. For whatever reason, normally, I don't know, I use Edge and also not a MacBook, but normally React's throwing that key warning won't do anything. For whatever reason, this time it just didn't. I also think another thing is, with the useEffect that we did earlier, is just leaving these brackets empty. Basically, useEffect is we're calling some sort of function, and whatever's in this array is basically our list of dependencies. Right now, there's no dependencies. So what happens if there's a new post? Well, we probably want to get our feed again and render our feed again. So one thing we can do is add our dependency being our post state. So whenever our post state is updated and we add a new post, get feed will be called and it will render that again. I don't believe it matters too much in this case, but it clearly didn't render, so that's another thing. But yeah. Yeah, just to test it again, if we add another message, hello again, and we post it, right, in our console log, you can see that it's not a giant blaring red error message, and we have our hello again post at the end. So you can probably, well, you can sort the posts differently, so you'll have the most recent at the start. We're not going to go over that right now, but it does have to do with map and indexing. But yeah, so now we have our working message box and our working post. Does anybody have any questions before I go on? Yep.
I have a question regarding the submit post.
Yep.
The one click, you made it an arrow function. Why do we have to make it an arrow function? What happens if we just say one click?
So this is just some React jankiness. If you call only add post, so you didn't have that arrow function there, it will call add posts when it's mounted. This is basically just saying it will call add post as soon as it sees add post, which means that it's going to call it infinitely. This can just lead to a bunch of random undefined behavior. React doesn't allow, when you render too much, you can't like render stuff infinitely. And if you keep calling functions such as add post, it will like render infinitely and React will throw a bunch of errors. If you do it this way with a arrow function, it actually just passes a reference to the arrow function. And so it's just a weird thing that's a part of React. You kind of just have to, if you're using an event handler and you want to pass it a function that's calling something, it can be an HTTP request, an Axios request, whatever. You want to do this. Another way is you can use useEffect, but this is honestly just easier. And in some scenarios, you won't be able to use useEffect. So
would you say it's best practice to always use an arrow function?
As for industry, well, I've never done web dev in industry, and I honestly don't know how they handle this, but I would say this is pretty good practice. So at least it won't make your website crash. Yep. So usually it's F12 if you have Windows. On Mac, here, I'll go back to it. On Mac, I have no clue what the F12 key is, but I'll just close it right now. But if you just do a right click and you hit inspect, it will pull up this F12 menu. This shows you all your nice sort of HTML, but if you go into the console, every sort of web browser has a console, so that's where it will show errors and stuff. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, cool. So this is pretty much the end of our workshop. Just as we go, I'd like to present a challenge to you. Basically, just add liking to posts. And just for some hints, here is the API request for liking a post and also using a button, and an Axios request. Can you implement a very similar thing to the post except for its liking? But thank you all for coming. Next week, we'll be diving a little bit more into backend integration and some more advanced React stuff. If you have tokens, please come to the front. We want to give you cool and awesome stuffed animals. And there's some extra slides at the end, but yeah, cool.